If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. For those who explore abandoned and rundown places, what was the scariest paranormal or creepy thing that ever happened to you on your adventures? We had an encounter with a possible supernatural presence in a military base in the German forest that had previously been used by Nazi and Soviet soldiers. There were lots of big buildings with long, dark corridors, but upon entering this particular building, we immediately felt a chilling cold. Ignored it at first because it was winter time, so it was pretty cold outside of the sunlight, but it definitely had a different vibe from the other buildings we had explored earlier. In there, all of the sensations were heightened. The air was colder, darker, stiller, and heavier. At one particular moment, my husband and I were in two different rooms. When I wanted to take a picture of something, my camera lens suddenly became milky white, and I was unable to focus. It was as if I were looking into a heavy fog. I carefully checked my camera for condensation, but there was none. I looked again into the viewfinder, still totally fogged, even though my eyes could not detect anything unusual in the room. At the very same time, in another room, my husband clearly heard a woman's voice calling him by his name. It sounded like my voice, but he felt something was wrong because I always call him by a particular nickname. So instead of following that voice down the dark hallway, he came to me. Just a few seconds after he had entered the room, the fog was gone, and my camera lens worked normally again. It sounds crazy, but we believe a bad presence was trying to confuse and separate us that day in order to do us harm. Exploring a large abandoned factory, I was in a warehouse on the top level of a large concrete building built in 1940. There were two very old incandescent light bulbs still working, although I had a headlamp, and it was filled with pieces of machinery and parts haphazardly on shelves but also all over the floor. Someone who worked here told me this area had been abandoned for decades and was creepy even when the factory was running. Anyways, I was poking around this area, looking at stuff, and I felt this feeling of dread and foreboding coming over me. This was a really bad feeling that I just couldn't shake. I ignored it, telling myself it was nerves, and continued. On the far wall was a bank of doors that opened up into machinery space on the other side. Those doors opened to a level about 3 stories high, right at the tops of machinery. There's no reason anyone would be up there. When I got close to the doors, there was an extremely loud banging right on the other side, like someone was smashing a pipe against a railing. It happened about a dozen times in succession, and I froze and went into full fight or flight response. Big adrenaline dump. Needless to say, I boogied out of there. I'll note I was tiptoeing and walking quietly, so I doubt anyone heard me and was trying to scare me away, although this is a possibility. It was also stormy at the time, so possibly the wind might have blown something around. Those buildings aren't super well sealed up in some areas. This factory complex was originally built in the early 1900s, and about a dozen workers died there over the years. It was also built on top of a native village. Perhaps it was a spirit telling me to go. I've thought about it a lot, and I'm still not sure. I used to explore the old industrial area in my town with a few friends. We were not part of any exploration group or anything, we were just curious. Anyway, we broke into a shutdown textile factory from the 50s/60s. Not a super old building, but still cool. It had weaving machines, rolls of fabric, old stuff, etc. They had just gotten up and left, it seemed. It was really cool to explore. We explored the main floor for about an hour and then decided to go down to the cellar level to check that out. I found a changing room for those who used to work there. I was getting the hibby-jibbies at that point, as I hate dark, claustrophobic places that lack windows. Friends convinced me to check out the showers with them. Reluctantly, I agreed. The first thing we find is a huge hole in the wall leading into a maze of hallways and dozens of rooms. Of course, our stupid asses go into the wall hole. We open one of the doors, and it's basically a fully furnished home with beds, bookshelves, books, a storm kitchen, pots, etc. I opened like 5 more rooms, and it was the same in every room, beds and shit. It was like the hobo capital. I opened the last room, and to our horror, the pot was boiling. We just looked at each other. We knew some duck was down there with us, hiding in the hallway maze, watching us. I have never run so fast in my life. When I was 7, I lived in Maine with my grandpa. I loved to explore the huge woods behind the house. It was an early October morning. I decided to go explore the woods. As I was walking along, I heard a faint sound of leaves crunching. I stopped, and the sound stopped. I turned around and saw nothing. I continued to walk for another 5 minutes. The crunching of leaves came back, and it was louder. At this point, I'm nervous. I'm looking around, and I see nothing. I start to fast walk, and the crunching is getting louder. I start to run, and whatever is following me close, I get out of the woods and run to the front door. I look at the woods. I regret turning around, and I see these tall, lanky things. Its skin is jet black, it has 2 little slits for a nose, it has 4 fingers on each hand, its teeth are jagged and sharp, and its eyes are orange and glowing bright. It made an ear-piercing scream. My grandpa saw the thing and heard the scream. He ran out of the house with his rifle and shot at it. The thing ran into the woods at lightning speed. I was so scared. My grandpa got me into the house as quickly as possible. Later that day, he went and measured the tree. The thing next to it was at least 8 feet tall. Now I'm 14 and I live in Vermont, and this thing haunts my dreams. There used to be an old, gutted down mental institution just outside Pittsburgh, near my house. It had a fire in the 1970s or early 1980s, causing some major damage, but it was still standing. Dixmont was its name, if you want to look it up. Anyway, me and my friends broke in and explored this place for hours on end one day. It was massive. The first building we went into was the medical wing, complete with its own morgue. They had the freezer with the pull-out tables and everything. The creepiest thing there was the table on which they embalmed bodies. It was porcelain and was still standing, actually pretty clean looking given how long it had been there. Elsewhere in the main building, there were all of the patient rooms, common areas, and worker areas where they disheveled medicine from behind the glass. The paint was peeling like crazy, and it was that nasty, mental institution lime green you always see in movies. There had always been rumors of a tunnel that led down the hillside to the Ohio River, where they secretly shuffled patients in and out of the home, etc. We ended up finding a tunnel and decided to walk it with our flashlights. Thank God we were paying attention. After a few hundred yards, the tunnel ended down the hillside near a power station for the hospital. The exit to the power station was about 20 feet off the ground, with no railing. Had we not had flashlights, we would have walked right out of the tunnel and dropped to the concrete ground below. Eventually, Walmart bought the property and razed the whole thing to build a store. A landslide happened shortly after and covered up the highway below, so they had to pay to fix and shore up the land and ended up never building a Walmart. A bunch of wasted money and the loss of an amazing old building with tons of history. This one takes place on a friend of the family's land in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, home of the Hodag, but this isn't about the Hodag. Mr. H's family was one of the original white families in the area. They owned a ton of land around Pelican Lake, and over the generations, they had parceled a lot of it out. They still owned a ton, about 6,000 feet of lakeshore property plus all the land that stretched from it to the roads. It was a lot. The homestead had 3 houses. One was the original house, which was built in 1800. One was built in the early 1900s. And one built in the 1920s. They were all within 100 or so paces of each other. Apparently, Mr. H's grandparents lived in one, and they built 2 more for each son, one of them his dad. Nobody was ever allowed into the 1800s house, according to Mr. H, because the house was dilapidated and the floors were rotten. One evening, me and Mr. H were playing cribbage in the kitchen of the 1920s house, always the main one people stayed in, opposed to the early 1900s house, and I kept hearing a whistling. I finally asked if he heard it, and he casually said yes, and we went back to playing cards. Finally, after continuing to hear it and me asking where it came from, he said, "It's my grandparents whistling for the kids, my dad and uncle, to come in for dinner." I just stared at him. He looked at me and said, "They're harmless, you just need to realize they grew up, lived, married, raised families here, and are buried here. Tomorrow, I will take you to the family graveyard down the road. Also, don't be concerned if you see someone in house 1. Which I did. That night, walking back up from the fire pit, it felt like someone was watching me from the windows of house 1. I looked up, and his grandma was staring at me from her kitchen window. They had pictures of her in house 3. While he said they were harmless, I'm not sure I believed him. Whenever a ball or something would go near house 1 and I had to get it, it was like walking through an invisible wall where the other side felt heavy, depressed, dark, and menacing. It was a nice evening. The sun was going behind the tree line, so there wasn't a lot of light. Me and my friend Sam were getting bored, so we decided to go check out a few old buildings that were a good mile away from his house. The first building was a single-room church that was about 150 years old. Every window was locked, and the door was chained and bar locked, but there was one window that was broken and only had a clear plastic tarp over it. Being the rebellious teens we are, we tore the already worn tarp away from the window. We hopped through the window and started to explore. There wasn't much in there at all, so we just decided to move on to the next place. The next place was a rundown old house just down the road from the church. We made sure that no one saw us approach the house, and we started up the porch. I wasn't paying attention, so I didn't notice that there was an especially worn plank on the porch, and my foot broke through. We were worried someone might have heard it, so I took my foot out, and we rushed inside. The inside was very cluttered, like someone had been rummaging through things in a hurry. What surprised me was the big hole about 3 feet in front of the door, like it was a trap. We made sure to be extra careful after that, and I started to video the exploring. We walked around for quite a while but didn't find much but an old picture, a rusty knife, and a doll, naturally. At one point, I looked at the wall and noticed what looked like claw marks that had slashed through the wallpaper. Me and Sam looked for a second, then moved on. We ended up leaving, so his mom didn't get mad at us for staying out for too long. A few weeks later, I decided to watch the footage because I was looking through my camera roll and came across it. I was watching, and my heart stopped when I realized something. When we went in, the door at the bottom of the stairs was opened, but when we left, the video picked up a slam, and when I pointed the camera down the stairs, the door was closed. Someone was in there with us, and luckily, the basement was the only place we didn't explore. This was a couple of years ago, when I was still in college. I worked at my local high school in South Jersey on the night shift for some extra money, but unfortunately, the hours meant I didn't really get to have a life during the week. I got a call from my friend group on a Friday before I headed into work saying that they were going to explore Clinton Road, which was known to be the scariest road in NJ. Obviously, I couldn't go, so I told them to let me know how they made out. Later in the night, I get a call from them in panic, saying all these crazy things happened to them. They described what happened to them, how they threw coins over the Ghost Boy Bridge and they came back, a ghost truck following them, and the feeling of being watched. I thought they were just hyping it up because I missed out. So it was decided we'd all go the next night, but this time, I got to see it for myself, something I'd regret for the rest of my life. Being from South Jersey, Clinton Road is a bit of a drive for us, about 2 hours, so there was plenty of time for us to get all hyped up and spooked out. Now I can only describe myself as the manly man of the group, being 6 feet 5 inches and 260. Especially back then, I had the persona of, it's all made up, nothing will scare us. Boy, was I wrong? Right when we got there, the entire vibe changed from we're all going to be spooked. Oh, wait, this is actually pretty damn creepy. The road is in the middle of the woods, and houses are few and far between. The first thing we see when we get there is a small, mini castle-looking building, which is the best way I can describe it. And because of the long ride, we all had to pee. So I went to the left, friend 2, Joe, went straight, and friend 3, Har, went to the right. Friend 4 was a female who stayed behind us on the road. After I was done, I immediately walked back along with Har, but we noticed Joe walking towards the creepy building. I start shouting, asking what he was doing, and he turns back around with a look of shock. Me being completely confused? I ask, "What are you doing walking there?" Joe swore up and down that I was actually behind the building, waving at him to follow me to the building. So naturally, we are all getting freaked out. We pull up to the bridge, the Ghost Boy, and I check everyone for coins to make sure they don't fake it just to scare me. We all throw the coins, nothing happens. See guys, it's all in your head, let's go, so we all start walking back to the car. Cling, cling, cling. I hear the coins hitting the road. We sprint back to check, and we find the coins laying on the road. I was 100% convinced they were just messing with me. So I had the idea to mark a coin so they couldn't fake it. I threw the coin in the water, waited 5 minutes in silence, and nothing happened. See guys, let's go. Cling, cling, cling. I hear coins in the road. I walk back. I'll be damned. It was a coin with the same exact markings I put on it. I'm extremely freaked out at this point, so we decide to go. Driving down the windy road in a newer sports car, we are all freaked out and just want to leave. We see headlights appear seemingly out of nowhere behind us. Did not see them attached to a vehicle. I'm no car expert, but I bet my life they were lights on an old truck. Getting closer the faster we went, taking bends at fast speeds that even a new truck wouldn't handle. Suddenly, the lights disappeared. So now, all in panic, we decide to pull over to map our way out. Dead silence, no light except our headlights in the woods. We hear the typical woman ghosts moan, and of course, what came with it was the typical woman in white dress standing in the woods right next to our car, and she let out the loudest scream I have ever heard. We are scrambling at this point to get out of Dodge. Once we make it back to the main roads, we decide to dig a little deeper on this road. Apparently the ghost truck tries to make people crash on the Dead Man's Curve. There have been numerous bodies buried there by the famous murderer the Iceman. On our way home, we were so ballsy and wanted to go back again the next night, Sunday. We suddenly pass an old, run-down church that looks like it hasn't been used in 50 years. And of course, the sign left out front says, "You need Jesus on Sunday." It is safe to say that I never went back, and even up to this day, the friend group still refuses to talk about what happened that night on Clinton Road. As a kid growing up in western PA, there was an old abandoned railroad in the woods near my house. The railroad went through a valley with a pretty large, winding creek. There were several cuts and tunnels through the hills of the ravines and valley on either side of the creek. I'm pretty sure this railroad closed down in the early 1900s, and by the 80s and 90s, it was overgrown with tunnels in a pretty advanced degree of collapse and looked more like natural caves. Needless to say, this was a perfect area for playing and exploring the woods with a kid. From a kid's perspective, I'm pretty sure most parents wouldn't want their 11-year-olds exploring abandoned railroad tunnels. One year we had an exceptionally warm December, and I had a few friends staying over at my house for Christmas break. Of course, I wanted to take them down to the railroad tunnels. I probably hadn't been down there since last summer. As we are approaching one of the tunnels, we get stopped dead in our tracks. In front of a tunnel, we see this gray, skeletal figure holding a scythe. We take off, running back in the direction we came. My neighborhood was about a half mile to a mile away, mostly uphill, and we came bursting out of the woods breathless in one of my neighbor's backyards. He's out doing yard work, and obviously he's curious as to what we were up to. We tell him what we saw, so he assures us we did not indeed see the Grim Reaper and offers to go back into the woods with us. So we all go trekking back down to the creek with my neighbor. We come to the tunnel, and sure enough, there he is. Skeletal figure, gray, wearing a black cloak, a distorted, twisted body, and holding up his scythe, which looks like it is an extension of one of his arms. He is just standing there, motionless and silent, guarding the mouth of the tunnel. My neighbor motions for us to hide, and he and the Grim Reaper have a stare down that seems to last forever. The neighbor starts laughing, to the degree of tears coming out of his eyes, and he has to sit down and tell us to come out and see. It was a tree that was hit by lightning. The trunk basically exploded. The bark from the tree was still attached in places that appeared to be his cloak, and the twisted, exposed portions of the trunk appeared to be his body, head, arm, and scythe. It probably happened a few months prior, and the exposed trunk would have weathered gray already. Even now, knowing what caused it, it was still super freaky to look at and still made us nervous, so we were happy to leave. This thing was so perfect it almost looked like someone had carved it with a chainsaw, but the wood was too rough and split for that to have been the case, and it was a completely natural phenomenon. A few months later, I returned with a camera and some other friends to show them the Grim Reaper in the woods, but it was completely gone. I could not even find remnants of the trunk or root system from the tree, they just vanished. It may be of note that we would often find satanic graffiti in the railroad tunnels, pentagrams and such, sprayed on the stone cliffs and walls in and around the tunnel. It also appeared that lots of people had used the tunnels to have parties, get high, etc., as we would sometimes find syringes, burnt spoons, and the like. I probably haven't been back down to check the area out in 20 plus years, but I keep telling myself that one day, when I'm home to visit, I'm going to take a trek back in the woods to see how things are holding up. This happened in 2010. I believe I was 8 years old then, and we were on summer vacation in Italy, in the region of Tuscany, where some of our family is from. We, my brother, dad, and I, were hiking in the country, far away from any towns or any other form of big civilization. We were not very familiar with this route, though. All of a sudden, we stumble across what looks like an abandoned Tuscan farmhouse. Not very big, though. We all look around and yell, asking whether there is anyone. It looked very abandoned, the door was missing, and plants were all growing over the place. It is safe to say that no one lived there. So, since we love adventure and it didn't seem like a bad plan to do with 2 children, we decided to take a look at the place. As we were going to enter the house, out of nowhere came a barn owl flying out of the house. It was dark in there. So we had a quick scare, but nothing too bad, it's just an owl, right? Now we enter the house, and we just find the typical stuff you would imagine to find when you're in an abandoned house. Cutlery and plates on the ground, a candle, some old paintings, nothing really valuable, though. Now we see an old wooden ladder that leads up to a hole in the ceiling. It was not a very big hole, my father couldn't fit. To give you an idea, he is like 6'2", and so since I was the oldest of the 2 kids, I would go up and tell them what I saw upstairs. Now I went up the ladder and got into a room where I could see barely because the windows were covered with wood boards. So I could make out some stuff with a few sunrays that would get in through the gaps. I could see graffiti signs, typical for an abandoned house, right? And I saw another room, so I told my father and brother that I would advance there and see what was up. As I opened the rotten wooden door, I immediately stood still. A disgusting, rotten smell penetrated my nose. I almost had to throw up. I wanted to know what caused this bad smell. Then, in the corner of the room, I could make out a silhouette. I got closer to investigate what it could be, and I could barely make out that it was the lifeless body of a big dog. And, in spicy detail, the body was skinned. No fur, nothing. Just pure rotting flesh in the shape of a big dog. I don't remember how long I just stood there, frozen. But I woke up from my shock with the screams of my brother because apparently the barn owl had gotten back inside the house, and it almost hit him. So my dad yelled at me to come back, and I gladly obeyed. When I got back downstairs, I told him what I had seen, and the look he gave me was that of a man who is scared to SHT but doesn't want to admit it in order to not scare his young kids. He just got close to my ear and whispered to me to run. We ran out of that place and never got back, not even close to the route leading to it. I don't do this often. Me and my friends just got bored and thought, why not explore an abandoned factory we know? We got flashlights and went there. Well, as you'd imagine, we found broken things and papers and files everywhere. The place was huge. We found an open space where we guessed the machines were located. We took some pictures. We pranked each other a little. It was kind of dark in there, so we were understandably a little scared. But I guess we were not alone in there, and we should have predicted this since the place had been abandoned for a long time. Some people have been using it to drink and do drugs because, after a bit, we found a room full of bare bottles and a very suspicious plank of wood with traces of something white on it and knife damage on the table. We got scared thinking that if we're caught in here and some get the wrong idea, it's going to stink till it's cleared up. So we started heading out. It was getting dark and kind of hard to see what we're stepping into. Suddenly, we heard some noise. We heard people talking and footsteps. We turned off the lights and hid in a random room. We already left the room with the setup, and we were far from it. People were inside the factory with us. We just stayed there, terrified, in the darkness, trying so hard not to step in some BS and make noise. But I guess the men were already drunk or something because they would trip way too many times and they spoke weird. They passed us and were headed to what I can only assume is that room. After hearing that they were far away, we slowly turned on the lights and carefully left the place. Called the cops and reported seeing some suspicious people going into the factory and going home. Well, later, we heard the cops arrest 4 men under the influence of drugs and carrying huge knives. Apparently, they stabbed a cop and tried to run, but were successfully taken down. Well, I'm not surprised they were not in their best condition. But it scares me a little to think about what would have happened if they found us there. They did not hesitate to attack a cop, so I don't think they would care about some teenagers. We were one of the first people to explore these old houses after some historic flooding. Recently abandoned after being underwater for nearly a month. It was eerie. One of the houses had actually floated downstream and left nothing but the foundation and old knickknacks. But the creepiest part came later, when we discovered a house that was very religious. Bible verses on the doors and on the walls. Figurines and Bibles are everywhere. Nearly all the walls were mirrored too, which added to the creepy factor. Pitch black at night, with only flashlights reflecting back and the occasional face of Jesus or one of the disciples. I remember there being a very disturbing quote on the front door about hellfire and redemption, but I can't remember it exactly. The reason I saw we were one of the first and not the first people there was because the only damage was that someone had spray painted, "Do you believe in the devil?" along the side of the house. My mother's a pastor, and I'm an atheist. I've seen some religious fanatics. I've got nothing wrong with religion, I've seen how it can help people. That's not my problem. But having all of this at 12 a.m. in a pitch black forest with nothing but the river as ambience is creepy as hell. Other than that, I mostly just see what's left of people's lives. Of the 8 houses, nearly none of them looked like they had evacuated. Hell, even someone's mobile home was still there. Sheets on the beds. Pictures on walls are knocked off from the water. The only way you could tell they were abandoned was by the light coating of mud and the musty smell. Seeing elderly people's oxygen containers and wheelchairs left behind by kitchen tables just broke my heart. So this encounter happened many years ago, and I was very young. It was in 2001 or 2002, and I was 11 or 12 at the time. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I do not know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and I decided to accompany him one Saturday to scope out the property. From our home, it was a little more than a 3-hour drive, but we all love riding in the car, so while it was not going to be the most eventful road trip, we went just to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remember being very underwhelmed by the place. There were no houses anywhere near, and hardly any signs of life at all, apart from a few birds, and the wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque. Still, we parked our car off the road to go explore the woods a little. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting, which is not really my cup of tea. As we walked through the woods, it was a very nice day, but still, something felt off. Everyone in our group remarked about the eerie feeling, but my dad and uncle seemed to laugh it off. My mom had goosebumps and kept looking over her shoulder, which made me on edge too. She was very insistent that it was weird and she wanted to leave, saying it felt like she was being watched. After a bit of hiking, I noticed that there was a small red building. I've seen bigger storage sheds in the suburbs, but they looked well built. My uncle said there was nothing about it on the listing, so we went to peek inside. The door was open. And inside there were open cans of food and a ratty blanket on the floor, and it stunk unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. Following this discovery, we all agreed it would be best to get back to the car if there was some crazy hermit living in the woods. We didn't want to be around to find him. The only issue was that we had walked pretty far into the woods and now weren't exactly sure which direction was correct. The eerie feeling really amped up, and we were all on edge. We ended up trekking another mile before we finally found the road, but we were further down from where we had parked the car, but at least we could just follow the road now. Walking along the road, we came across a truly unsettling sight. Right in the middle of the asphalt was a dark gray cat on fire. I have no idea why a cat was out in the middle of nowhere or how it came to be killed and set alight. Obviously, this had just happened, but there was no one in sight. Naturally, we ran the rest of the way to the car. There was a huge scratch in the paint all down the side of it, from hood to trunk. Thankfully, that was the only damage, and my dad was able to start it without any trouble, and we drove away as fast as we possibly could. My heart is speeding up just recounting this moment, which is definitely one of the scariest of my life. Needless to say, my uncle did not buy the land. And I'll always remember this terrifying encounter, but like anything, over time I sort of pushed it to the back of my mind, and it just became one of those odd moments you occasionally retell at family get-togethers years later, so much so that it's almost just a funny story. The reason I'm sharing this is because I was reminded of it last night while binge-watching some episodes of BuzzFeed Unsolved on YouTube when they shared the story of a family that disappeared in the same area while also looking at some land for sale. The disappearance of the Jameson family is the name of the mystery in the video, if you're interested. The family died in the same area we were searching, roughly 7 years after we made our trip there. There are many theories about their deaths, including the allegations of some sort of cult in the area, complete with something about dead cats. Coincidence? Probably. But the whole story gave me chills. So if my family narrowly avoided being killed by some witches or a cult or whatever, or if we just stumbled upon a hermit who didn't want us in his woods. There's a long bike path at the top of the street I grew up on, with a strip of wood separating it from the nearest highway. When we moved in, our subdivision was only about half finished, and the rest of the lots were construction sites. Some of the older kids who lived around us used to tell us about a weird guy who would sneak around our neighborhood and look in people's windows at night, but we never believed them because we thought they were just making shit up to scare the new kids. One night I was staying over at my friend's house, and we stayed up really late playing Halo on the original Xbox. It was storming really heavily outside, and we decided to sneak down to his kitchen to grab some more Pepsi, hoping his parents wouldn't hear us with all the noise outside. We were standing in his kitchen after grabbing the sodas when there was this huge flash of lightning, and we saw a guy standing in the middle of his backyard in the storm, staring straight up at us through the kitchen windows. We ran upstairs, but when we looked out the window to the yard, he was gone. We didn't really talk about it after that night and figured maybe we just imagined it because neither of us wanted to admit being scared shitless, but a couple weeks later we started exploring the woods around the bike path and found a kind of weird Dugan fort full of a lot of stuff that appeared to be stolen from the construction sites around our neighborhood, and one of the things we found was a pretty distinct and one mixtape basketball that belonged to my friend. It went missing right around the time we saw that guy watching us from his yard. Right as he and I locked eyes, we heard what sounded like a grown-up thundering through the brush and trees, so we ran out of there as fast as we could. We didn't even ride home, we rode our bikes maybe a mile and a half to our elementary school before we stopped, and it seriously felt like we had just escaped something really bad. I stayed over at his house again the next weekend, and when I went to ride my bike home the next afternoon, both tires had nails in them, and his and one basketball was sitting on the driveway next to his hoop, which had been slashed open. The next week, my parents left me at home to go to a soccer game with my brother and sister, and someone rang my doorbell while I was playing Unreal Tournament on my PC. My parents told me never to open the door for anyone, but when I yelled through to ask who it was, they said it was the police, and I could see a few cruisers sitting across the street. When I opened the door, they had an older guy in handcuffs, and they asked if my parents were home and if I knew the man. I told them I didn't, and my parents would be back soon. I later got the full story from my dad, which was that the guy had been messing around in the under-construction house directly across the street and somehow managed to cause enough structural damage to collapse on part of the second floor. When the police arrested him, the only thing he would say was that he was friends with the kid across the street. That was the last I ever heard of it, but I'm pretty sure he was the one that was watching us through the windows and who popped my tires. A house that couldn't be seen from the road, but we knew it was there. We always research all the properties we go to, and I mostly ask permission if an owner can be found. This was so deep and so long, swallowed by nature. I went around the back way, which seemed better as it was next to a boat ramp. I walked quietly through the scrub, backpacks getting snagged on branches. My BF is tall, I am not. We find the house and see it's kind of broken in half, resembling a V. On the right, I notice a bin full of KFC wrappers. Odd. There's no car path, bike path, or walking path. Any delivery would require a person to hike through the bush to wait for a delivery roadside. Possibility sure, unlikely though. We don't talk, but I point to the bin and say, WTF? He shrugs, and we keep going. Next, he goes to pull himself up onto the patio. He does it easily because he's tall. I have to figure out how to get up. On the left of me were broken steps. Again hidden by bush, then I notice a bell at the top of the steps on a broken wooden gate. Again, I point out the bell, and I'm mouthing something that's random as hell. There's no way someone lives here. If there is, it's either A, hideout, or B, a killer. No power. No water. Completely blackout. I get up, and we go to walk forward to the door that's got all the glass out, and we see an outhouse. An outhouse here is a toilet on the outside of a house, not inside. It's piled on the roof of adult nappies. Now I'm like, okay, this is even more odd, there's no smell. All we can see and hear is a mosquito bomb diving us and a room full of adult nappies. We probably should have backed out here, but we didn't. My boyfriend puts his hand on the glass panel to twist the door handle. He goes, oh, okay, it's unlocked, there's keys. He opens the door slightly, and we see the kitchen. We look in, and it's a kitchen full of old food. Piles upon piles of rubbish and food. So he pushes the door open properly, and we see an old person walking frame fall to the floor, and this huge-ass person stands up and shouts, "What do you want?" This is where we fly like ducking Jesus over the patio and leg it through the bush, our backpacks getting snagged on every tree. My tits fall out of my shirt as I'm running, and my boyfriend gets caught on a tree. We dump our backpacks and race to the car. We have nothing in them apart from torches, hand sanitizer, and a tripod to take pictures. I took off around the corner to see if anyone walked out or if cops came and found nothing. So we went back to grab the packs and left. I called the cops to do a wellness check because that ain't right. It felt so off. Nothing was heard back from the cops. One of my first experiences with the weirder and creepier side of urbex was when I first started back in 2014. About 2 counties over from where I live, there's a mental institution called Central State Hospital. Being on the older side of this county, remnants of the previous buildings from 1926 are still standing. From the historical documents and records that I uncovered while doing some research, Central State Hospital was built following the Civil War to aid in relief efforts for recently freed black slaves. But as time went on, the facility became one of the first in the South to offer mental hospitalization for black patients. The new building is now built right next to the old one. So after some digging, snooping, and spying, I finally worked up the gumption to break in and explore. Armed with a flashlight, a mounting curiosity, and a pry bar, I pulled back one of the boarded-up windows and crawled in. Not knowing what to expect, I began to wander the dark and creepy hallways of the old hospital, checking each room for anything interesting. The facility is basically one large square, with 4-story corners, most likely offices, 2-story corridors, and a now heavily wooded courtyard. Where I got in was the east front corner. I wandered most of the corridors until I found a stairwell leading downstairs. On the sublevel, there was a long corridor that held the autopsy room, morgue, and furnace room. Now, after an hour or so of looking around, reading old documents, and noticing some suspicious drug paraphernalia, I decided to make my way out, seeing as how it was going on at midnight. As I turned around to leave, I noticed that the street security light that you could see from the bottom of the stairs was now absent. To my absolute horror, a massive black figure, about 8 feet tall, stood at the top of the stairwell. Now, being the 6'7" bruiser that I was, I did the most logical thing any man would do. I screamed like the bitch I was, up the stairs, through the figure, out the prying open window, and into the loving arms of Petersburg's finest. Slapped with a potential trespassing charge and sitting in the back of a police cruiser, I was questioned about the screaming. When I told the officer what I had seen, he turned about as white as a sheet. Apparently, since he and his partner started doing rounds on the property, they had constantly seen apparitions all along the open windows on the top floors. Needless to say, I got off with a slap on the wrist and a no more kind of deal. There used to be this storm drain opening near the elementary school that I went to in Colorado. All through elementary school, kids would dare each other to go in, and nobody ever really did. A few kids stood a few feet inside, but that's about it. A couple years later, in middle school, my friend and I decided to venture in and map it out. We found that it went clear under the school, under the soccer field and baseball diamond, and into a neighborhood. The passage narrowed so that we, 7th graders at the time, had to crawl and drag ourselves along, but it eventually opened up into these big round rooms, with ladders leading up to manhole covers 40 to 50 feet up. We would bring flashlights and notebooks and try to map out all of the side tunnels. It was honestly a ton of fun. Once we were fairly far in, 15 minutes or crawling, after walking a little less than half a mile, there was a super sketchy looking adult man and his massive dog. We didn't hear him, and we stumbled upon him without ever having thought someone else would be in there. We hightailed it out of there and didn't go back for quite some time. When my cousin and I were younger, we spent a great deal of time together. We would get into all sorts of mischief, as boys do. I was staying over at my aunt and uncle's house and visiting my cousin one weekend when we came across something that, at the time, we didn't think to bring up to anyone older and smarter than we were. We live in South Carolina for what that's worth, and we were around the ages of 12 and 8, me being the older of the two. The area around my aunt and uncle's house has some small, densely wooded areas, but overall, the area isn't anything I'd consider rural. We decided to explore an area of woods across from my aunt and uncle's house, a spot we hadn't really explored much of. Not too far from the road, we came across an old house. It wasn't in bad shape, and it even had a little garden with a well-tended flower bed. Our first thought was, reasonably enough, that we'd run into someone's yard. Passing through, we noticed one of the windows to the home was broken, so we decided to peek inside. There wasn't much of anything in the house. It was devoid of furniture or anything else that would imply that someone actually lived there. Naturally, we tried the doors to see if we could get in, but no luck. We then heard a car pulling up to the house from the opposite side of us. My cousin and I darted for the tree line and followed some power lines into the nearby woods. A large section of the woods here had been cleared out to allow for the power lines to be where they were. So picture a clearing of around 100 or so feet surrounded by woods on either side. After following the power lines for quite a bit, we got hit by the unmistakable smell of something dead. We kept on and noticed a wooden tower stand off the side through the woods a bit. We excitedly hurried to investigate it. On the way, we found a dead dog, which would explain the smell and wasn't too unusual. Then we found another, and another. Surrounding the entire stand were the corpses of dead dogs. It had to be over 30 carcasses. They were all in varying states of decay, some seemed only a few days old, and some were nothing but bones. We were alarmed, but we were still dumb kids and wanted to climb to the top, so we did. At the top, we found even more dog carcasses. So process this, not only were there bodies of dead dogs surrounding this tower stand, someone put forth the effort to drag them some 30 feet up a slim ladder to the top. Unsettled, we made our way back to my aunt and uncle's after that. We never mentioned it to anyone, or at least I never did. Thinking back on it, 15 years later, we definitely should have said something. I've tried looking up similar things in the area, but I haven't had any luck. We never went back there after finding that horrible scene. I also wouldn't conclude that the house we found or the person that showed up there are in any way related to the tower stand. That's just how our story began. Having grown up in western Montana, I've spent my fair share of time in the woods. About 6 years ago, I was back at my parents' house after my first year of college. The family was bored, so we decided to go for a walk in the woods. My parents' house sits right against about 400 acres of private land that's all forest. The owners didn't really care about people hiking in there, so we would explore it often. On this particular outing, we went a different way than usual and found ourselves coming up on a small circular clearing surrounded by 10 to 15 good-sized trees. Little clearings like this aren't out of the ordinary, but as we got closer, I could see that there were papers put up on each of the surrounding trees. Naturally, we go to check them out. As I approached, they appeared to be wanted posters, so I assumed someone had just been having a bit of target practice. When we actually got close to the trees, though, I could see there were no holes or punctures in the posters, and that they were actually missing persons posters. Each poster was a totally different person, and they were fairly degraded, as if they had been there for maybe a week or so, but still easy to make out. Not totally creeped out yet, we kept milling about until we found 2 trash bags completely full of similar posters, all different people, and the remains of a small fire in the center of the clearing. At this point, I think everyone's spider sense was tingling, so we just wordlessly left. My sister told me later that day that she lifted the poster from one tree, and there was what appeared to be a crude picture of a snake eating its tail drawn on the back of it. I didn't see this, so I can't confirm. I've gone and checked out the area a handful of times since but haven't found anything. That's it. Maybe I'm just a baby who got creeped out for no reason, but I've never come up with a good reason as to why someone would set something up like that in the middle of the woods or why they'd have all those posters. My best guess is some weird or amateur ritual. In high school, I and my friends knew a guy named Gene. For whatever reason, Gene had a habit of telling extremely tall tales centered on himself, trying to make himself look cooler. The most repeated one was his claim that, in a nearby ravine, a coven of druids practiced and were schooling him in ancient magic. He always played them straight, as if they were unquestionably true. He never had any evidence, they were always said in a matter-of-fact way, as though they didn't need evidence because they weren't the slightest bit unbelievable. While taking a walk one night, I happened upon a construction site. Being heavily into urban exploration, I explored the heck out of that site and, upon leaving, tipped their porta potty. I was still a bit immature, and I thought it was funny. After that, whenever I found one, over it went. One day, I told some friends about it, and Gene, ever the showman, chimed in with, "Oh, that's nothing. I like to burn them down." Arson was most assuredly not our thing, and we knew Gene was full of bull, so we were surprised when, calling his bluff, he offered to prove it by showing us the fruits of his labors. 5 of us piled into the car, only one of us had one, and followed Gene's directions. The site was in a rural area with lots of big hills and dense forest, common in the Pacific Northwest. At a sharp elbow on a 2-lane road was a gravel turnoff, leading maybe 100 feet into the woods to a gravel parking lot. This was the starting point for a number of hiking trails. There were no lights there, and the streetlight out on the road didn't show much through the trees. There were no other cars there. One of the trails began past a gate, designed to keep off-roaders off the trails, and took a sharp left from the back of the parking lot. The porta potty had been about 30 feet or so up the trail, and on a later visit by day, we found out that Gene really did turn it into a puddle of blue goo. That night, we didn't get there. We had a couple of flashlights, and we all started up the trail as a group. As far as I can recall, we never heard any noises, animal or human. We got about halfway to the spot, then all of us stopped walking. Someone whispered, "Do you feel that?" And we all bolted down the trail, piled into the car, and got the hell out of there. Once on the road, we compared thoughts. I felt what everyone else did, the deepest, most intense raw fear I've ever felt. It was like we suddenly faced an impending death. It clearly indicated, I need to leave, right this instant. I can only guess there might have been a cougar or something, as they've been known to attack hikers, but we saw nothing and heard nothing. I've read that if a little voice in your head tells you to do something, it's a good idea to listen. Part of me wonders if Gene's porta potty fire pissed off some forest spirit or something. I've been back to that trailhead a few times during the day to show friends where this happened. I've also brought a friend who's sensitive, as they say, and they didn't pick up anything. To start things off, I'm a local filmmaker in my area. I like to make short, found-foot horror films. It sounds dumb, but this is important information to know going into the story. I normally film abandoned buildings because I love the atmosphere and the look of them, but one time a couple years ago, I stumbled upon something that made me almost stop exploring abandoned places altogether. For context, I live in Pennsylvania, and there's a really popular abandoned location called the Ruins near Allentown. I really have no idea what it could have possibly been, but nowadays it's a bunch of concrete buildings, tunnels, and walls, all decayed and crumbling. It's actually a really beautiful place. This place has a few different locations. I was exploring it with 2 other friends while location scouting for one of my films. I separated from them in an effort to try and get the feel of a character from the movie and find the most unnerving spot. They went toward the main buildings, and I walked more into the forest. On our way in, I noticed a structure off the path that I had never seen before. After walking through the overgrowth and bushes and shit to find it, I finally stumble upon this building with a huge hole through it. To get a sense of what I'm looking at, imagine a concrete square, but with no front or back walls, so it's got a roof and 2 side walls. Crumbling buildings are usually a common sight at the ruins, but what really freaked me out is the fact that there were a bunch of small, dug up holes in the dirt on what should have been the floor to the building, almost as if they were little graves. There had to be at least 8 small holes there, and they all had markings, like little crosses or wooden symbols sticking out of the ground next to them. I have no idea what they were being used for, but I never saw anything like it. I was worried that whoever dug them was going to come back to bury what they intended on burying, so I left as soon as I realized what was going on. I met up with my friends, and I didn't mention what I saw to them. I don't know if I was too scared by it or if I just didn't want to freak them out. Still thinking about what I saw just makes me feel uncomfortable. The funny thing is that I've gone back there countless times, and I've never been able to find that building or the graves again. Nothing even looks remotely similar to it. I don't know what I stumbled upon that day, and I really don't know if I want to find out. I'm one of those people who tears up a bit when talking about something truly terrifying. I'm tearing up while remembering this experience now. I had a close and dear friend years ago. We went to high school together and instantly became close, as we enjoyed everything. Movies, games, activities, and so on. This friend had a beautiful cottage in Muskoka, which was about an hour and a bit from the area we lived in. They would talk about it a bunch, saying how awesome it was to go there in the summer as it was right on a river and was perfect for swimming and paddle boarding. They also said it was kind of haunted, just passing comments about how it was spooky, how they'd hear things at night, and how it was probably home to a ghost. They always said this jokingly, like it was no big deal, so we'd usually laugh at the idea that their beautiful and pretty much newly built cottage was actually a ghost house. Fast forward a couple of years, and they invite me out to their cottage in October. The family was going up, and my friend asked if I could come with them. I was super excited to go because I'd never really been to Muskoka and knew how beautiful it could be, especially in the fall, and also how often my friend mentioned the fun they'd have at the cottage. I want to now preface what comes next with the fact that I have never had any paranormal stuff happen to me, ever. I don't disbelieve it and never have, but I've never been in a position where I'd feel like, okay, this is definitely paranormal stuff until this event. We get to where the cottage is located in this small community called Matthiasville. As soon as we enter, I get this weird feeling, like a shadow has been cast. It was a beautiful sunny day with good vibes all the way up until we crossed the bridge that led into the community. The weather turned overcast, but it wasn't that, there was a heavy and weird energy. We've been driving along the riverside for some time. I tell my friend about the energy feeling, to which they say, "Oh, I know, it's weird, right? Like heavy." Things lighten up, however, when we arrive at the cottage. This place was absolutely beautiful. New build, 3 floors, a big deck on the 2nd floor, and tons of windows that went floor to ceiling. It overlooked the river, and it had a forest trail at the back. The trail was way too thick with brush and wood to even try navigating, so we spent a lot of our time out by the water and on the big deck, chilling. We'd drive into the nearest town, Bracebridge, for some outings, and at night we dedicated our time to beating the COD, World at War campaign, split screen. It was an absolute blast. We went for a long day walk to and saw some of the interesting points of Matthewsville, a big dam, and beyond that, a strange and small graveyard that was situated on a slight hill at the very tip end of the community. All the graves were old, and some of them were unmarked. Others you couldn't even make out what the stones had written on them. It was eerie, but nothing out of the ordinary happened for the first 2 nights we spent there. On the 3rd and last night, the dad had to head home early for some work stuff, so it was just my friend, their mom, and myself hanging out for the night. The mom was sleeping in the loft way up on the 3rd floor, and we made the basement floor our home for the weekend. We decided to watch a movie and eat snacks, but when that was finished, I suggested we go out for a night walk since it was a clear night with a big moon out, and I loved going for night strolls, plus we hadn't really been out and about after dark, and the place was pretty beautiful at night too. My friend was really against this. They said the place was spooky enough during the day, let alone at night. I managed to convince them, and out we went. We were walking along the road that went along the river, towards the dam and the end of the community, where the graveyard was. We made it about a quarter way when my friend stopped dead in their tracks. I looked back to see what was up, and they were just standing there. They looked defensive. I asked what was up, and they said, "We need to go back, like now, this feels weird, and I don't like it at all." I asked if they were scared, like if they heard an animal or something. As soon as I asked that, we heard a deep and loud cracking and snapping of wood in the dense forest above us, on a rocky ridge that was beside the road, on the opposite side of the river. I looked up to where we heard it, and it felt like everything, hushed crickets and all other nighttime sounds, seemed to have just stopped. My friend quietly said my name. I looked back at them, and then suddenly the bushes and shrubs underneath the ridge on the side of the road exploded, as if something huge jumped in them and thrashed around. This made us bolt, and I remembered just saying run as I followed behind my friend. We ran non-stop straight to the basement door of the cottage. We got there in minutes, but it felt like seconds. We ran straight into the basement bedroom and both hopped into the bed. I remember saying it was likely a coyote, a raccoon, or something. As soon as I said those words, a creaking started forming up above us in the living area of the first floor. The creaking soon turned into slow, heavy footsteps, back and forth, and loud as if someone were wearing work boots or something. I remember my friend, through tears, saying, "Does that sound like a coyote to you?" I cannot even describe the absolute feeling of dread that washed over me, like there is something up there taunting us. We lay in complete silence for what felt like hours. We got into bed at around 3 a.m. after our walk, which turned into a run, and the footsteps didn't stop for an hour or so. I remember finally falling asleep at 6 a.m. when we woke up. The first thing we did was, of course, ask the mom if she had been awake last night around 3 a.m. She wasn't. She hadn't even gotten up once to use the bathroom, she said. Even if she did, we would have heard her door open, and then the footsteps down the loft stairs. Everything was open concept on the first floor, so it was easy to hear things going on. We packed up and left. My friend's parents sold the cottage a couple of years later. I don't think any of them went back once after that weekend. I was curious about the area afterward, so I did some Googling and learned that there was once a sawmill or something like that, and a tragic accident happened. I believe the owner's son drowned or had a bad accident in the mill, something tragic like that. I want to say that could be a factor here, but who knows? All I know is that night I heard heavy, clear, and loud footsteps pacing around us on the first floor. That was my first and only paranormal experience, and I'll never forget it. A solid 5 to 6 years ago, maybe even longer, I was a frequent visitor to an abandoned hospital, being into photography and urban exploration. I've had my fair share of odd experiences with doors slamming shut and things being knocked over, always putting it to wind or other people around. The last time I went was roughly at 2 to 3 a.m. after a couple of hours of exploring. We were getting ready to leave when we heard doors creaking and then a loud glass smash. A big rush of cold swept over me like something passing by in the hallway, but no one else felt it. We bolted out of there and haven't returned since. After that, in the location and in countless other places, I've noticed street lights turning off whenever I'm near them or directly under them. It often happens when I am alone, of course, but sometimes when I have company. It's been consistent for years and years, in different places, but always the odd one, when I'm under it, switches off and cycles, comes on for a few minutes, and then backs off. Does anyone have any theories behind this, or is it just one of those random coincidences? A little over a decade ago, I met and started dating a gal who lived in Toland County, Connecticut, so I hauled up from down south for a visit. I know it's a bad idea to cross, many in this case, state lines for a relationship, but this was my early 20s, and I still thought I knew everything and that it would turn out differently for me. Spoiler, it didn't. At any rate, perhaps the one fond thing I took away from all that was said visit, which involved a lot of the country of Connecticut, is that here in the South, at least, we tend to think of up north as big cities and industry. I was honestly surprised when I got to her place, and it was trees, rolling hills, and even the distant mooing of cows. Now, I can't exactly say why, but despite all this familiar terrain, something inherently felt different about it all. This isn't something I can outright put into words, but there was something that enchanted me about the northern wilderness. I had to drink in as much of it as I could. I spent a lot of time dragging her through the brush. We explored some abandoned mills, found an odd ring of chairs in a clearing, and just generally frolicked and had good summer journeys. Except for this one place, we found. I don't know what it was. Maybe an old theater or a roller skating rink? All I can remember is that it was painted black and had these murals of outer space scenes like flaming comets and ringed planets on the outside. Everything about the place seemed to scream 1970s, but I might be wrong. Now, I'm a seasoned explorer of the abandoned. I even went into the so-called Devil House of Falkland at night, alone for parts of it, and didn't flinch. I'm also used to strange things. I think you can't really live in the country much and not have a tale or two that doesn't add up. This place bugged me. It wasn't anything stereotypical, like a cold feeling or an intense sort of dread. It was more a feeling that something was wrong. It felt out of place, and though it seems like just the sort of place I'd love to explore, it's, to date, the only place I turned away from. Here's the thing. I wanted to go in. I wish I had. But I simply could not even try. Something about that feeling was so foreign and off that I literally could not compel myself to do anything but turn back. And that's just what I did. I'm hoping maybe someone up here might know just what that place was. I tried digging it up and researching every few years, but I get nothing every time. The girl and I didn't last much longer, and I don't think she knew what it had been or what happened there anyway. Near my house is an abandoned high school in a not so great part of town that's been closed for about 20 years. All windows were boarded up, but there were a few entrances that were wide open. We checked out about half of the building, and we were hearing this whistling noise that started in the middle pitch and got higher on the second and third floors of the building. I heard it every few seconds, and the pitch of the whistle was consistent with no differences between the whistles. On the ground floor, dead silent. We originally thought this was either a gang call whistle or the whistle of a street gang, but it didn't sound human-like. The wind was almost still too, so it can't be that. Is it possible the building may have paranormal activity? My friend did see some kind of spirit or ghost that looked like a child hiding behind the door on the second floor. Anyone have an opinion or idea of what this whistling noise could be? I had a couple creepy things happen as a child, but I believed what I had experienced then could not have been real as time went on. I was actually a harsh skeptic of anything paranormal. Despite my disbelief, my friends and I liked to check out the rumored haunted buildings in the area. I had no belief in this stuff, so I had no fear or problem walking into this one abandoned building full of bats and blowing out the candles of a satanic altar or ritual site someone had created there. But one experience in 2010 at an abandoned naval academy in Lake Elsinore changed my mind for good. I had been there a few times before, as it became one of the most popular spots for high schoolers to explore. One night, one of my friends brought a Ouija board there, which I played with without any hesitation or fear. Again, my firm belief at this point in life was that anything paranormal was all BS. And if ghosts and spirits were real, then they could do no physical harm anyway since I'm alive and they're dead. Absolutely nothing happened while playing with the Ouija board, which is what I expected. This was just another reason for me not to be creeped out by the place, despite the satanic symbols and the wall of old magazine covers with eyes gouged out in the basement. Anyway, after an uneventful day there, we had planned to go back again with more friends who wanted to see the place. When we returned a couple weeks later, we had a group of about 10. As we walked through the large building, we would occasionally toss old cans and bottles to startle our skittish friend and the couple girls he brought. I thought it was funny how they were so afraid. My best friend rode with me there that night, and he had told me about paranormal stuff he'd seen in his life, and I harshly criticized him, and I even made fun of him for it too. But this night at this abandoned naval academy led me to apologize to him for all those times I didn't believe him. After some time exploring the first and second floors with the group, we made our way down a very narrow staircase to the lower underground level. We were just hanging around a bit at this point, and everyone was having a few separate conversations about what to do after. Then my best friend's phone began to ring. It was his strict mom calling. She'd flip if she found out where he was, so I asked the group to keep it down so he could lie to her and say we were at my house. Eventually, the rest of the group decided to leave and refused my request for them to wait for me and my friend, who was on the phone. Like usual, she wouldn't let him off the hook without giving him an earful. As the rest of the group left the basement and headed up the stairs to the exit, I just stood facing him with my arms crossed, waiting for the phone call to end. It was so long, that's all I could think about. I could hear the group getting farther and farther away in the building every few seconds, but eventually I could only hear my friend and his mom. To exit, they had to go to the top floor and cross another set of stairs that led to the first floor, where a board had been removed from the doorway, so it took a minute to get out of there from where we were. What happened wasn't all that much, but it still gives me goosebumps typing about it right now. After not hearing the rest of the group for a couple minutes, my friend's phone call finally came to an end, and as he said all right, bye to his mom, his flip phone screen light lit up brightly for a second, displaying the time of the call, then dimmed immediately. With the sudden flash of light, a bald, transparent person about our height and slightly reddish-gray appeared to my right, his left, just standing there slightly illuminated like it was its own dim source of light. It was just feet from us, as if it were waiting with us. As soon as I saw it, I only turned my eyeballs at first, and my head followed slowly. All my hair stood up, and I felt cold instantly. I didn't even say a word, and before I turned my head, my friend fumbled his phone while looking directly at it and covered his mouth, and we watched it clearly standing there, staring ominously for at least 5 seconds, and then faded away, seemingly out of existence. After it vanished, my friend looked right at me and said, "Did you effing see that?" This made my heart sink even more as he described to me right then and there what he saw, and it matched exactly what I saw. This made the long, dark walk out of there actually terrifying for just the two of us. It was so clear that I could see the moonlight coming from the tiny windows reflecting off of its eyes, which was the last part to disappear. We didn't run, we just stood there in disbelief for a minute or two. Although it was scary, it brought me some assurance that there's something after death. I live in the UK, and this happened 15 years ago. I was a 17-year-old goth and loved all things creepy, horror flicks, frilly dresses, big boots, the lot. I became friends with a group of lads who were nothing like me in the way of style or music tastes, but what we did like to do was explore. We would go walking around random places and find some hidden beauties within the city of Nottingham. But all of this came to an end one night, and only one place was on our minds. This was a church that was a short walk away from where I grew up. Once we walk through the main roads, we get to the narrow walk through what is known as Strelly Village. It has a narrow path down one side and a road big enough for one lane with houses down one side. When I was a child, my parents would take me to the pub, which was halfway up this road and faced the house opposite. We would see the horses in the field next to the pub, and it was a great place to relax. So I had the idea to explore what was further along the road, past the pub, with my new friends. It was a winter night, the sky was clear, and we set off walking along the road. We got past the pub to find ourselves in a thick fog. We couldn't see our hands in front of our faces. It was that bad. So we all linked arms and continued up the path to where the road split. To the left was the road to a bridge over the motorway, as we later found out on another exploration. But the right took us to Strelly Church. At first, we felt fine. We sat ourselves at the big doorway and went about rolling our smokes, laughing and joking as we normally would when we heard footsteps. We all froze, looking at one another, confused. We had a street light that cut through enough of the fog for us to see that no one had followed us here. One of the guys I was with, let's call him Dan, went off to see who was making the sounds. He walked around the church and saw nothing, but as we came around the corner, we heard something fall from above us. Like a slate had fallen loose and crashed to the ground behind the church. We all went around, and we saw nothing there. The ground was clear. We heard the footsteps again, but this time they came from the front of the church. We were all freaked out, running around to find no one there again. I felt eyes on me, and I knew from that point on that something wasn't right with this place. We heard more noise, we looked up at where it was coming from, and that was when we all saw it. A dark shadow of a man in robes on the roof of the church. As soon as we saw it, it jumped, only to completely disappear before hitting the ground where we had just been standing. We ran, not stopping at any point until we were at the main road. We were all trying to figure out what we had just seen. But that was where it really started to get strange, for no matter how much that place scared us that night, we kept going back. It had some kind of hold over us. Each time, we felt like something was drawing energy from us. Each night was clear. After that night, we could see distant lights of the city across the farm fields, and we never saw that fog again nor the shadow figure. But I still felt as though we were watched, but not only by what we had seen that night, but by the many houses as we walked up through the village and by the graveyard across the church as we sat on the bench before the gate. I haven't been there in so many years but still feel its pull when I drive past that road leading up to the church. Those eyes are watching me as I go past. Whatever it is that has that hold on me, I fear it will never let me go. I grew up in a very rural area. As a kid, I do a lot of exploring. Once, when I was about 11 and my brother was 8, we were riding our bikes down an old trail on the edge of our neighbor's property. We frequented abandoned dirt roads often, so we knew if we just kept following the trail, we'd eventually end up at the main road, about a quarter of a mile from our driveway. We came across an old red iron lean. There were cow carcasses hanging from the top post in various states of decay. This spooked us, and we got out as quickly as possible. We really didn't speak about it after that, but we both still explored. I had found a house when I was about 16 or so but never had the courage to go in. It was about 2 miles behind our neighbor's 22-acre property line. I didn't really worry about it because of how far it was, and I didn't want to go that far out on someone else's land like that again. Now here's where it gets weird. At 22, me and 2 other friends got drunk and decided to go exploring. I knew how to get to this house because there's a trail. It's overgrown from years of neglect, but it's still a viable trail. We get to a clearing, and there's the house. There is a rusted 1950s pickup truck parked beside the home. It's white wood and still in pretty decent condition. The lawn was shorter, almost like it was fresh cut, and it looked like they needed to weed eat around the truck and house. I didn't think much of this at the time. We don't plan to go in at first. We walked around the back and saw there was a whole trailer behind the house. The two were connected by a crudely made awning and porch. We could see that the back door of the house and the front door of the trailer were both open. 1-quart glass jars were everywhere. I mean dozens. Some are on the ground under the porch, and a lot are on the platform. There were so many that they spilled out of the trailer and house. Most were empty, but some had a clear liquid. We decided not to enter the trailer because that seemed to be where the majority of the jars were. We were unsure of broken glass and assumed the liquid was moonshine as it wasn't growing algae like some of the others. We go through the back door and find the house in disarray. Paper everywhere, tons of water damage. The roof and floor were caving in some places. I found a calendar from 1973 hanging. Old toys and books were just scattered. There was no seating or bedding furniture, but there were a couple of tables and a desk. The craziest thing I found was a box within that desk. It contained pencils, blank papers, a shorthand book, and some records. The records showed large sums of money being paid not only to the local school but also to several people. The area I grew up in has a lot of old money and generational wealth people, and I recognized many last names. One of the names I recognized was my 70-year-old old landlord's. The sums of money were anywhere between $50 and $6,000. The larger amounts were paid to the school frequently, too. They'd get a check at least once every week, sometimes twice a week. Never for less than $1,000. At this point, one of my friends found a plate and glass on the kitchen table. It was dirty, like it had food on it at one point. There were dirty dishes in the sink, too. This kind of weirded us out, so we left at this point. It's been about 10 years since that day. A few weeks ago, I was shooting the shit with my dad at about 2 in the morning. We were talking about living there for so many years and how we had so many memories. With it being so late, I felt a little spooky, so I told him about the house. I did not tell him about the receipts. After hearing my story, he kind of nods and says, "Yeah, that's Mr. Cup's house." I had never heard of this dude in the 20 or so years I've lived in this house. The more I got to thinking about it, the more I felt like I remembered that name on the records. I asked my dad how he knew about the house, and apparently, when we were little kids, my parents had too much to drink one night and took some of their friends out there to go ghost hunting. He saw pretty much the same thing I did. He told me how he gets to the location, and I realized the road I found those carcasses on as a kid was one of Mr. Cup's driveways. The other came out about a quarter of a mile to the opposite of my house. I then told him about the receipts and our now deceased original landlord's name on them. He tells me he doesn't know about all the receipts, but he does tell me that way back in the 50s, Mr. Cup and our landlords were at odds about where the property line was. Mr. Cup had proof of his side of the land. The landlord had filed a motion to stall the lawsuit, and eventually, after years of fighting, it was settled that the property Mr. Cup was living on was theirs. Some of the details in regard to why Mr. Cup didn't get his land are fuzzy to my dad. He does know that the landlords didn't tell Mr. Cup that he had to vacate because they didn't want him to appeal. So for about 10 years, they let him live there and didn't mess with him. At this point, he's in his 70s, and it's in the 1970s. The landlord gave Mr. Cup's property, in addition to a lot of property behind our neighbor's acreage, to her daughter as a wedding present. They forced Mr. Cup to pay them in order to stay. The daughter used the money to fund a clubhouse in the middle of the property. They also redirected his access road, the trail, to lead to the clubhouse. This went on for some time until the couple, who were now in possession of the property, decided to divorce. The guy was the brother of my little brother's best friend, Dad. His family home was right down the road from all this. He managed to win all the property in the divorce, and the wife got the money. The first thing he did was go to Mr. Cup and sell him not only his property but also all the property that was originally theirs, including the property the club was on. So Mr. Cup closed off all access to the club and the access point furthest from him. He left the one closer to his home open. Then what? I had asked my dad. He shrugged. Nothing, he lived a few more years and then died. They found him at the kitchen table a few months after he had passed. I don't know who owns this property now, nor do I know who has been maintaining it. The only other person in this area with that last name spelled it differently and was not originally from the area. I know nothing else about it. I don't even know what was in those jars. I think about this sometimes, and the more I think about it, the more questions I have answers to. In Binghamton, New York, there's an ominous abandoned Masonic temple overlooking Main Street. One day, during exam season and one of the larger snowstorms of the semester, we noticed the usually chain-locked doors ajar when we walked past. Desperate for some recluse and a little hammered, we decided to step inside and not but our cell phone flashlights. There was evidence of squatters and homeless dudes who used it as a sanctuary, but it seemed to be empty. Or, more likely, maybe this was just us rationalizing to convince each other to stick around. There were about 6 of us, so every scrunching footstep sent reverberating echoes throughout the halls. Some rooms were filled with trash and rubble, while others were well kept and dusted without a broom in sight. Some rooms had odd numbers of wooden chairs propped upright, while others had heaps of crushed cement and fast food wrappers. While most of the rooms were tiny, like a college single-person dorm, there was a huge, sprawling auditorium that had an open floor with an extreme sheen. One room had a dentist's chair and literally nothing else. This was our last ounce of courage, and we hightailed out of that room. We found a staircase leading to entire floors with freshly painted walls. We eventually got to the roof and looked over the snow-fallen city, Batman style. We were ducking SPOOKED, but we had each other, flashlights, and Old English. This story comes from Belgium and took place in 2020. I was 20 back then. At the time, because of the severity of the pandemic in Belgium, the law stated that you could only go out to practice sports or to work, so I took the habit of meeting with a friend, Sully, to go out for runs and to practice all kinds of sports in general. Both of us were quite fond of urban exploration and knew a spot on the outskirts of Brussels consisting of an old sports and wellness center where we took the habit of hanging out after our runs. To get into the spot, you must go through a hole in a fence on a street, cross a small portion of wood, and you'll come up on a football pitch and tennis courts. Up on a hill is the center, which is an old 4-story building. On that day, we had just finished a 5-kilometer run and went to our spot as usual. We were walking to the building since it was about to rain when we saw 2 teenagers sitting on the roof edge, and I remember thinking that it bothered me since we were planning to go to the roof as well, so we went to the hall area to wait for a bit in hopes that the people would leave. In the hall area, you have a clear view into the kitchen, which you must go through if you want to go to the roof. You can also see into another smaller hall and into the dining room. Sully was rolling himself a cigarette while I was gathering 2 chairs and an office table for us to sit at. This next part gives me chills to this day. As I finished setting everything up, I remember starting to feel unwell, as I was being watched, and not in a good way. That's when I looked at the kitchen and saw, for a brief moment, a head sticking out of the door frame and staring right at us. It was a man. I couldn't say what age he was since he was all dirty, but the one thing I remember is that he had an exaggerated happy expression on his face, like he had just found exactly what he was looking for. At that moment, I just froze and was unable to react bravely to the situation. I leaned slowly towards Sully, all while keeping eye contact with the man, and told him very calmly that we had to go immediately. I tend to make lots of jokes to all of my friends, and especially to Sully, but when he saw the look on my face when I told him we had to leave, he didn't say a word, he just took his backpack and stood up. We ran to the football pitch and saw that the 2 teenagers were still on the roof, so we started to tell them, asking if the man was with them or if they saw him, but they answered no. They hadn't seen anyone and had come by themselves, so if someone was there, he wasn't with them. We told them it was probably better for them to leave as well, since we didn't know what the man in the lobby was up to. They told us they would be fine and they would leave a bit later. We decided to leave since we had already told them what we saw and we had already been out for a very long time, so it wasn't very legal with confinement rules. As we were walking towards the woods, I turned back, and I could swear I saw a silhouette standing in front of the staircase leading to the roof, but my mind didn't quite react, and I just left along with my friend. I was so shocked, because nothing like it had happened to me before, that I just decided not to talk about it to anyone in fear of them not believing me or possibly making fun of me. My friend Sully is the only one who was there. He didn't take a look at the man, but he is as scared as me just by seeing my own reaction at the time. I don't know what happened to these teenagers. I found local articles and papers dating from that time about teenagers being chased by a crazy man in an abandoned building, but the information given wasn't enough for me to be sure it was the same people and the same story. In December of 2016, I planned to explore an abandoned distillery in the woods in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, for the first time. It was freezing cold and still dark as I walked through the woods at like 5 a.m. As I got closer and the sun started to come up, I started to see the outline of the buildings. My light revealed a crumbling plywood board leaning against a tree with the words "Stay the hell out" sloppily spray painted on it, but other than that, the place was wide open. I knew there was a farm nearby, but other than that, this place was isolated. After crouching down in the woods for a little while until it wasn't completely dark, I entered the first building. I thought I could faintly smell something foul, but because of allergies, my sense of smell wasn't at its best, so I brushed it off. The place was massive, and after shooting lots of pictures, I started making my way through the other 4 buildings. I kept hearing weird sounds that might freak out other people, but I was an experienced explorer. I was still kind of on edge and nervous because I'd never been here before. The smell started getting worse until I could really notice it. Finally, I climbed up a staircase with several steps missing and entered the final building. When I flipped my light on, it revealed tons of graffiti on the walls, which was surprising because there was practically none anywhere else. There were wooden pallets everywhere, and small bullet shells scattered the ground. I noticed a pair of old boots and clothes, but they looked like they'd been there for a while. I noticed an old chalkboard on the wall from when the distillery was still active with some weird stuff written on it, but it kept going. And the smell, it was terrible at this point. I started walking around more curious than anything else, not worried about photography or anything else. The pallets were stacked maybe 5 feet high, and I rounded a corner in the sort of maze and stopped. To that point, I'd never had anything crazy happen while exploring, but I knew I finally had a horror story. There was a big open space in the pallets, with blood smeared everywhere and bugs everywhere. There were hunks of carcasses and a pallet stack making a sort of table, or altar, and I was mortified. Further inspection revealed it was some sort of animal, but regardless, I sped out of there as the sun had finally come up and didn't look back. Each year, me and one of my closest friends, whom we will call Dane, go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a nice, small, peaceful town in the North Georgia mountains. Me, my friend, and his grandpa are all outdoorsy people, so we are always looking for something fun for all of us to do around the area. One night, we decided to go explore some trails not too far from the cabin. Now, these aren't the kind of trails you're probably thinking of, they really are more gravel and dirt roads, but a lot of hunters, campers, motorbikers, and backpackers use them. We headed out to the trail, and right as we pulled up to the trail we were going on, we noticed an older, suspicious-looking black Chevy SUV with 2 middle-aged men in it parked next to the entrance of the trail. Even though this is a safe area, drug deals and other kinds of sketchy activity can occur deep in these woods, so we avoided going on that trail and decided to head down to another trail about a half-mile down the road. We pulled about 50 or so feet into the trail just outside of view from the road, parked the truck, got out, and started our exploration. Our little night hike was off to a great start until we got about a mile in and started to hear a dog bark from probably about 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the dog just would not stop barking, and we didn't know if the dog was on a leash or not and could come attack us, so we decided to turn around and head back. Looking back, I'm really happy we turned around when we did. When we were about, I would say, 1,000 or so feet away from the truck, we could see a car sitting behind my friend's grandpa's truck running with its headlights on. This instantly made us worried because who would just roll up behind a random truck at 10 o'clock at night on an isolated trail? Keep in mind that you would have had to drive into the trail to see where we parked the truck, it was not visible from the road. We stood there for about 5 minutes, trying to see if we could see anybody, but since it was so dark and pretty far away, it was hard to see anything. Fortunately for us, there was a pretty large tree next to the trail we were able to stand behind, so there was no way they could see us from where they were parked. My friend Grandpa took these night vision binoculars we had with us to try and get a better look, but it was still not much help. We decided to just stand there and wait for them to turn around and leave because there was no chance we were going to walk back with this random car with potential bad people in it sitting behind our truck. After about 10 minutes of just standing there, to my absolute horror, the car drives around the truck and starts to head down the trail in our direction. As fast as we could, we climbed up this hill right next to us and hid behind a log that was sitting up on the top. A few seconds later, the same beat-up black Chevy SUV we saw outside the other trail we were originally supposed to hike on comes driving down where we were just standing, not even 15 seconds ago. The car had its windows rolled down and started to slow down as it drove past us. Me, my friend, and Grandpa were terrified, our hearts were pounding out of our chests, and we were scared these guys would stop and sit there or, even worse, get out and start looking for us. Fortunately, the car just kept driving and never stopped. As soon as the car was out of sight, we got out of our hiding spot, booked it back to the truck, and got the hell out of there. I know this may not be as scary as some others, but to us, it was definitely pretty frightening. We don't know who or what those guys wanted. My guess is they had a stash on that trail deeper in the woods and thought we stumbled upon it or something and were out there to confront us or even worse. A lot of things could have gone wrong. We could have walked up to the truck just as they pulled in. What if they came out and looked for us? What if they slashed the tires on the truck? Or what if they turned their headlights off and sat there and waited for us to come back? My friend and his grandpa actually went back in the daytime a few days later to the exact spot where we were hiding. After my friend and his grandpa went back, they said we were very lucky to have made it up there successfully, as it seemed impossible to do it as fast as we did, especially with all the shrubs and thorns in the way. If we had gotten up there just 2 seconds later, we would have been seen. I can only imagine what could have happened if we didn't make it up that hill and those guys saw us. I just want to start by saying that this was my very misguided idea. I regret it immensely and feel terrible for bringing my friends into it. You don't need to tell me in the comments how stupid I was because I am very aware. In 2010, when I was 15, I became interested in urban exploration photography. I absolutely loved seeing beautiful, eerie photos of abandoned shopping centers and hearing about all the awesome vintage stuff people would find at these places. I was originally thinking of going to famous local urban exploration sites, like a very well-known abandoned mental asylum called Larendal Mental Asylum. There are many creepy and weird pictures of this place online, and many stories of paranormal stuff happening there. About a week before my best friend, A, her boyfriend, G, and I were going to go, I got talking to an acquaintance, S, at a party who warned me off. She told me about how she and her cousins went there a while back. They were all very into spiritual/supernatural stuff, I believe. Nobody else was there that night except them, and apparently, they got horrible vibes as soon as they walked in. While they were exploring upstairs, one of her cousins felt an overwhelming force pulling him towards a room, and just before he opened the door, he fell through the floor and slashed one of his wrists so badly that he nearly bled out. She said she would never go back or to anywhere like that again, but if I ever found a cool house, I would let her know. So I was like, hell no, not going. I mostly gave up on the idea and just didn't think about it for ages until I found the house. So, I was going for a bike ride one day a few months after this and decided to take a different route to my normal one, and I ended up running through this weird little pathway at the bottom of a dead-end street and kept riding until I ended up at this park. I had never been there before and was very, very disoriented at this point. I was basically lost in my own suburb, more or less. Anyway, I ride through this park to try and find a water fountain and end up going down this long path, which leads to nothing except this really high stone wall covered in dead vines. The stonework on the wall was a really unique design, and it just seemed really odd and out of place, so I felt this urge to see over it. I stood on my bike and even then was only able to look over this wall, and I'm not short. What I saw was a very, very weird mansion. The garden was absolutely overgrown, a sea of green broken only by Greek marble statues poking out, and the house was yellow. And the bottom floor windows were all broken, but I could see that black and white checker, parquet, flooring and more statues inside. The windows on the top floor were boarded up except for one that had curtains. There was also a fountain in the garden that was cracked. It was the oddest and most out of place house I'd ever seen, and my instant urge was to photograph it, but I didn't have a camera or my phone. So I rode back through the park and picked a house number to remember, and I managed to make my way home even though I got really, really lost. I instantly messaged A, G, and S, the girls I met at that party. I told them I found this incredible abandoned house and we needed to check it out ASAP. My best friend immediately got super excited because the plan was that we were going to start a blog and she would write about places we explored. I would take the photos, and her boyfriend was excited because he is super into horror movies and wanted to film stuff. S was a bit reluctant. She said the statues sounded kind of creepy, but she eventually decided she would come. So we made a plan to go on Saturday night because G wants to film at night, and we're all scared of being seen by people in the park, so it seems logical. We'd meet at A's house, and G would borrow his dad's trailer to bring a ladder so we could get over the wall. So Saturday night rolls around. At this point, I was nervous because it hit me that we were breaking in or trespassing, and if we got caught, my parents would flip out and never let me go out again. But I ended up at A's, S arrived, and G arrived. We ordered a pizza, drank some beer, and hung out for about an hour because we decided to leave the house at midnight. It was weird because it should have been awkward. A and S were only sort of friends, S and I barely knew each other, and S and G had never met, plus G was older and hanging out with a bunch of 15-year-old girls, and yet we were all just so mutually excited and nervous that it was really cool. I remember distinctly thinking about how the four of us were going to be best friends and do this all the time, how cool the blog would be, and already planning where to go next. So we left at 12 and made it smoothly to the house number I'd remembered, and G parked the ute, and then this is where we encountered the first problem, because I led us down the wrong street, and it took about half an hour to find the park, and G was carrying this heavy ladder and getting really pissed off. So we finally find the park, and I just remember feeling a bit uneasy. It was very, very dark. No lights in the park or streetlights were on, and it was really sort of still and quiet. So we started walking. I was leading the way and not even that sure that I was going the right way. The park had a really unpleasant vibe at night. It was odd during the day, but something just felt really isolated at night. So we find the path and walk down, and sure enough, we reach the wall. We were ages away from the car. I had assumed it was quick, but I'd been cycling the last time without carrying a ladder or a camera, so once we reach the wall, G starts getting excited. A is nervous but pumped, and so am I. S is uncomfortable. She goes, "I have a bad feeling about this" the minute we reach the wall. G climbed up, looked over, shined his torch, and freaked out, saying, "Jesus, those statues are creepy." He sits on the wall, and A goes up, then me, then S. We're all sitting on the wall, looking down at this sea of weeds and statues. She looked at me and shook her head. "I don't want to do this," she said, and I said, "You can wait here." She was too scared to wait, so we pulled the ladder up and climbed down it. As soon as we set foot in this garden, I was just filled with dread. I think we all were. The statues were very creepy and human-like. Up close, their faces were just wrong looking, their features were weird sizes, and they looked really unsettling, like their arms were twisted weirdly. We were completely silent. G is filming, and I'm taking pictures. We reach the back door, and it's unlocked. A goes, "That's weird," and we all nod. Once we step inside, we're in this huge, empty room filled with objects, clearly statues, covered in sheets. G pulls a sheet off one, and we all scream. It's a Greek statue with a horrible, human-like face painted on it, grimacing. "Let's get the hell out of here," S says. We realize S has stopped in the doorway. "I have never felt such bad omens, we need to leave," she said. I walked over to her, but G was like, "No, this is creepy, but it's probably some local kids, blah blah blah, it's a safe suburb, also my film, etc., and says he's staying." I was too scared to walk back through the garden or park without him, so we stayed. S is silently crying at this point. I felt like my heart was going to explode. So we keep walking through the house. I'm shaking too much to take pictures. We pass empty room after empty room, all filled with sheet-covered statues. We reach the bottom of a marble staircase. S is shaking, A is squeezing my hand so hard it hurts, and G even seems hesitant, but we start walking up. Once we get to the top, it's clear something is very, very wrong with this house. There are no doors except one at the end of a hallway, but every room is filled with odd, wrong-looking furniture. Chairs painted red in a pile in one room, tables that are too high, tables painted odd colors. Something was really off. We open a cupboard in one room and scream at a horrific, life-sized mural of some sort of bizarre person with inhumanly long teeth and hands. At this point, even G was freaking out. He was like, "Let's just check the last room and then get the freaking hell out." So we all walked slowly towards the door. Inside was a nursery. A black crib or old wooden toys? I can't recall what they were, but maybe puppets? And strange paintings of clowns, I think, or maybe more akin to the mural of that person or thing, on the walls. We didn't even step inside. G said, "Let's go right now, this place isn't safe," and we headed downstairs. As soon as we get down, we all freeze because some of the statues have been moved up against one wall. We drop our stuff and run to the door. G kicks it open, and we run through this horrible garden to the wall. I remember when I was nearly at the wall, S just screamed, and we all turned to see that a light was now on in the nursery room. We literally scaled this wall, jumping down and leaving the ladder. I sprained my ankle, but I don't look back as we all run through the park. We got in the car, and we're all crying and covered in cuts and scratches, and my ankle is already swelling. G gets to S's house to drop her off and just says, "We are never doing that again," and then nobody says anything. He drops me off next, then they leave. I had to sneak in through the back door so my parents didn't see me and freak out. S deleted us all off Facebook that night, and I never saw her again. I had horrible nightmares for a month afterward, and my ankle has never been the same. I didn't tell anybody about what, and neither did A. We're still best friends, but we never talk about it. She and G broke up not long after the event. Honestly, I feel like we were in the presence of someone or something very, very evil. So in late 2019, me and my girlfriend at the time decided to travel 3 hours to Liverpool, in the UK, through the thick snow and driving warnings. As an urban explorer on YouTube, I travel all over the UK, exploring the best and scariest abandoned buildings we can find. Anyway, I got told about this deaf and dumb institute left abandoned in Liverpool, so we decided to go visit. Upon arrival, it was pitch black outside and inside. We got out of the car and started walking around this Gothic-looking building, which once survived as a church, before coming to an institute. There, we found a little window, a way inside, so we took the chance and went inside. As I stood doing my YouTube intro, we could hear little banging noises from the other room, but we put it down to just being birds. We started walking around the corner towards the noises to investigate, and what we saw next shocked me to this day. At the end of my light shining stood a homeless man covered in blood holding a kitchen knife. I turned around to my girlfriend and whispered, "Head out the way we came," quietly, before man could see us. As we were sneaking back to the open window, we heard an owl get out of my house. As I tried to reason with my gut from a distance, explaining why we were there, he couldn't understand. He started running towards us, saying, "Stay there. I'm going to kill you. Get out of my house." We have never run so fast in our lives. We got back into the car, and then a man was banging on the window, running his knife down the glass. We eventually got away, But to this day, I wonder what would have happened if we didn't run or, worse, fell?